If you guys weren't here last week, we had Brother Ben West. He was in town. He was a missionary. He started off our time in Philippians, and we will go through this book in its entirety. But if you don't know, I'm just going to kind of highlight some of this, talk about what it was, what the book of Philippians was about last week. That it was written as a letter, not just written from anywhere, but it was written from prison. And this is Paul. So he was the apostle, a guy that was obviously used to be able to establish many churches, including this church in Philippi. And he's writing back to them after many years of being away, and after the church has been established. And they have given him a gift, and he's kind of given them an update from prison in a lot of ways. But whenever I was thinking about where we have been, so just a couple of weeks ago we preached a sermon from Ecclesiastes. And so Ecclesiastes is a book in the Old Testament, and that sermon was about the futility or the frustration of life, of trying to fill our lives with pleasure, of whether that had been in drink or any physical pleasures in work, whatever it might have been, and about how for whenever we're trying to do that, it's as if we're trying to fill this eternal void that only God can fill Himself, and we have to continue to go back to our vice over and over again to distract us, to be able to distract us from the fact that our void isn't actually filled, and that we actually still need God to be able to fill our life with that. Now, whenever we come to Philippians, we are reading a letter from a guy who really seems like he has figured out what life is all about. The fact of the matter is that he saw that eternal void that only God could actually fill, and then he asked Him to come into his life, and he has lived like it ever since Jesus came into his life. And so with that, whenever I was reading through the book of Philippians, I just couldn't help but see how much joy this guy has coming out of his life. And so with that, I was messing around, just kind of thinking about something in my own head, and I created a sales pitch for us this morning, okay? A sales pitch might go something like this. Are you looking for eternal joy or divine joy to come into your life that cannot be stolen by any circumstance? Well, look no further than the book of Philippians, because this guy has figured it out. All right? Now, I know what you're probably thinking, all jokes set aside for just a second. It's like, eternal joy that cannot be stolen by any circumstance. And you're probably thinking, I could come up with a circumstance. Fact is, I got a circumstance right now I'm dealing with that I'm not real joyful about it in the moment. All right? And with this, I'm just going to bring you through this text and show you what Christ did in Paul's life, and allow you to judge for yourself what you've been basing joy off of, or what you've been trying to get joy out of through life. Okay? Because I just going to kind of give you the end of this, is that, to be quite honest, all Paul has done has accepted the gospel. That is almost quite simply all he has done, but this is one of the things that I have to talk about this morning, because every time that we almost say gospel in Southwest Oklahoma, I am very afraid that our familiarity with that word allows us to lessen its meaning. And so I'm going to kind of rehash what the gospel really is. And so the gospel is that man has rebelled against their Creator, that they have chosen to be able to live in His world and their way, and they have rejected God Himself. And instead of God destroying mankind from the face of the earth as we deserve, He sends His Son into the world to die on the cross, to take the wrath of God upon Himself in order for those people who have rebelled against Him to be forgiven. And not just, He didn't just die in order for you to be forgiven, but He was resurrected on the third day, ascended into heaven, and is now reigning victoriously over all of the earth. And so whenever we're thinking about this gospel, I don't want us to be thinking about Jesus as this musty has-been. Okay, I know him because of the gospel. I know what he delights in. I know what he's disappointed in. I know what he is trying to do through my life. I have felt his guiding hand. I know him personally. And so whenever we say that this is the gospel, we can't just think of it as the good news or just a message I've heard since I was a child. It is the avenue for you to know the living Christ and to know that he is still living and well and reigning over all things. And so let's go back to that eternal void I started off with. Who can fill that eternal void? Only the resurrected Christ himself. And so whenever we come to know him in these things, you can bet that eternal joy is going to follow that, no matter the circumstances. But let's be sure that we're going to accept that joy in the way that God actually offers it, and we don't put some preconditions or some presuppositions to that, okay? But with that, I think that this passage is going to be very instructive to us, and so in the way that we do that. And so with that, I'm going to just pause, ask you guys to stand for the reading of God's Word, and we'll read through verse 18 of Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. God's Word, it says this: I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. You may be seated. I know that just reading through that off the first read here, and I've been making a really big deal about divine joy, and he only uses the word rejoice that might to lead us to the word joy one time through this, but that's kind of the crescendo of that passage. But what I want to be able to focus on is what is actually bringing him the joy. What is the source of his joy? And that's precisely what this passage brings out. And so, our very first point in verses 12 through 14, it is advancing the gospel is really the source of his joy. Okay, look with me again. See his circumstance. It is, I just want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me really has served to advance the gospel. Pastor Chuck Swindoll, he said he's got a quote that I have remembered for the last decade. It's funny for me to say that. Okay, I'm not used to being able to say things like that. But said that it goes like this: that life is 10% what happens to you, and 90% of how we respond. And so, whenever you're kind of thinking about that principle at work here and looking at what has happened to Paul. He has been put in prison for the sake of Christ, for the sake of just simply doing ministry, for the sake of just living for Christ. This is something that has happened to him, and he responds correctly. He responds in a way that he does not allow his circumstances to control him. Now, this is one of those things that I can observe just quite simply from my own life and just about everybody else's life, that whenever things are going south, so to speak, we have a way of responding that steals our joy. That I can quite honestly say that whenever I am maligned, that is, people talk about me, my joy is almost immediately gone. Whenever things just kind of get hairy, it's like and things are just happening to perhaps me and my family, as we have gone through life, my joy is almost immediately gone. And it's because of the way I respond. I do not respond by faith whenever my joy leaves me, but I respond and in my fleshliness of how can I fix it and what is the fastest way for me to go back to comfort. Okay? Now, This is one of those things about the gospel. Again, we accept joy and the way that God offers it to us. And quite honestly, to think that we're going to be about the gospel ministry and think that difficulty is not going to come our way is not reality. Difficulty is going to come, and we have to learn how to respond correctly to it. And so, but see how Paul does respond to this. He said, I know that this sounds bad. I'm in prison. You guys know that. I'm in prison and this sounds bad, but it really has served to advance the gospel. And so, see where his joy actually is lying with this. His joy is lying in the progress of the gospel. The King James is going to say the furtherance of the gospel. The gospel moving forward. Paul only is rejoicing. His ultimate joy in life is the fact that the gospel is progressing and the church of Jesus Christ is maturing. And he says, so whatever circumstances might come, they are going to be used to serve that end. Notice what I mean here, because the gospel advances outside the church, and I'm meaning to unbelieving people, and in this case, very unexpected people that would come to Christ. Verse 13, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard. King James says that it has become known through all the palace. So your version might also say the Praetorian Guard. In short, this is who those guys are. The elite of the Roman army. There was 9,000 hand-picked men who would actually be a part of this imperial guard. They were hardened men from the years of war. They were also men of great influence. They would be receiving double pay for the jobs that they were doing. These were guys that you would not expect the gospel to get to, because if you guys don't know, Rome didn't exactly like the Jewish faith, nor were they exactly appreciative of the Christian faith whenever this was coming or whenever this was written. And he says, I'm chained to one of them 24/7. These guys, they think I'm the captive. And now Paul's saying, now I have Rome as a captive audience. They can't take my life from me until the trial. I might as well share the gospel with them. Okay, and so this is kind of how it would have worked. He's not just a common prisoner, or else the imperial guard would not actually be watching over him. Paul is more than likely inside of a house, but he is chained to one of these guys with a chain of about 18 inches, one on the Roman soldier, the other one on Paul, 24/7. The only time that they're changed is whenever the shift has changed. And so Notice how this is probably happening. You can't spend that much time with somebody and not notice their habits, can you? I mean, come on. They didn't have Facebook to scroll through, keep them distracted. They're not sitting there watching TV on their phone while inside of Paul's house. They have nothing to do but listen to whatever Paul is going to be talking about. And so with that, here's Paul. He's not only telling them the gospel, but they are observing the patience and the effects of the gospel on Paul's life. If you guys remember, Paul used to be the guy who went out and caught Christians and threw them into prison until he came to know Jesus Christ himself. And now he is almost controlled by Jesus. He has divine patience. He is probably a very gentle man. They're able to see how well he loves the people. They're able to see that his words are aligning with his actions. And it says that they come to know that his imprisonment is quite simply for Christ and nothing else. They say, this guy isn't like a normal prisoner. He's done nothing wrong to be here. And the gospel advances because of an unfortunate circumstance. Now, with that, I'm just gonna be bluntly honest. If I find myself in Paul's shoes, sandals, whatever he wore, okay, I don't think I would have started off in a very joyful manner. Like, I'm in prison, okay? This does not seem like it's going to be something worthwhile, and yet Paul sees it as an opportunity rather than a setback. Okay, our circumstances, whatever it is that you're going through, 90% of how you respond to them. That is what life is about. Guys, I started off with that very bold proclamation of the gospel. You know Him. You know Him. That means it doesn't matter what circumstance that you're in, He's there. That means that it doesn't matter how bad it looks, He's still there. That means it doesn't matter how much you feel like you can't approach Him, He is still approachable. He is still going to divinely work in your life, and you should expect it. So don't allow your circumstances to control you, but go to Christ in order for you to be able to have the right perspective for your circumstances. But it doesn't just advance through people who wouldn't have actually came to faith unless he was in prison, but it does advance the church, okay? See what he means here, verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Kind of something that it looks like was going on was that Paul, before he ever got to Rome in the first place, that because of the persecution that the Christians were going through, they became silent in the things of the gospel. And I'm kind of reading between the lines there. You guys can kind of read it for yourself. But it almost looks like that they have lost their boldness. That suffering has caused them to be silent. And now Paul is brought into Rome as a prisoner. And it says that it has now emboldened the brothers, the church, inside of Rome. It has actually built a confidence in what? In the Lord again. And so be sure that we're focusing on what it is here. This isn't just Paul's words. It's not just a testimony of a mere man, but his testimony is pointing them back to the main thing again, isn't it? Our main source of life, our main source of joy. His testimony is only saying, look, whenever you are faithful and follow Jesus in the way that you're supposed to, your confidence is grown in the Lord and not in what we do as mere men. Isn't that awesome? Now, one of the stories that has really formed me in my adult life is that of Jim Elliot and the people that went with him on a mission trip. There's about 5 couples in all, and at a very young age, and I'm talking about in their 20s, they left the comfortable United States to move down to South America and begin their mission work. And at the age of 29, Jim Elliot and his crew, the men, were actually killed by Auca Indians as they were trying to reach them with the gospel. It does turn out for the good because their families go into the same people who killed them and shared the gospel as the women and children did, and the whole tribe was actually saved because of that. Okay? But one of the things I had never heard before from that story that I read this week was that Jim Elliot was a graduate of Wheaton College. And after the funeral, after everything had kind of settled down, it didn't stop people from becoming missionaries. Rather, there was a great influx. It actually emboldened a group of young people that were coming out of Wheaton College, and there was more missionaries surrendering to that ministry because of the sacrifice of a few young people. Okay? Now, we don't even have to go there to think because like people are dying, whatever else. That's not what's happening in our text. And you might even be thinking of that story I just shared. Cool story. I'm not going, okay? All right, I hear you. It's like, or you might be thinking, it's like, well, that's just another story to add to my mind. God doesn't still do that stuff in our day or in our town, the things like that. Of which I kind of get where your doubts are coming from. I just don't believe it. You want to know why I don't believe it? It's because of the book of Philippians. It's because of the Bible. I see that God is going to continue to do His work regardless of what we believe about Him or not. And what I mean by that, He is going to raise up a faithful person that I hope is going to be in your personal circle, who are going to go to people you wouldn't expect to be saved. And whenever they are preaching the gospel and they are just sharing their faith with them, those people you didn't expect to be saved are going to be transformed by the living Christ Himself. And whenever you begin to see that happen in our community, it's going to stir your heart to the point where you're going to be able to say, you know what? I can have confidence in the Lord too. I can be that. I can be close to Him. And your boldness is going to increase. And your faithfulness is going to increase. We can expect those things. It's not just a distant story from a foreign country. It's going to happen here. The Lord is going to do a work, and we can expect that. And so let's expect it together. But let's move on. Paul's joy is still surrounded around the advancement of the gospel. We're now in verse 15, and I just want to talk about some motives for advancing the gospel real quick. But it says in verse 15, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Verse 17, there's some of them that preach Christ out of selfish ambition. Okay? So try to get this picture in your mind of what was probably happening in the Church of Rome. Okay? Whenever we get mad in church anymore, I just hear it all the time. It's like, well, things just didn't go right in this church or didn't go right in that church. We're mad at the pastor, so we don't like organized religion. We're going to find a church that fits us. It's going to be custom made to us, right? Then we move on down to the church, to this other denomination or that denomination. Now listen, that might be unique to our time. It wasn't happening here, okay? Whenever you went into Rome at this time, there was just the church. It wasn't the Baptist, it wasn't the Methodist, it was just the church. And so, whenever Paul comes in, it makes sense that there was already some leaders who were helping lead the Church of Rome, and now the Apostle Paul is here, okay? And people are starting to go to him in prison to be able to hear what he would have to tell them. And so, now there's envy and rivalry starting to pop up amongst the church leaders. Now, I don't think you guys would be real surprised, but would it surprise you if I told you that still happens in the circles of pastors today? That our conversations are almost based on envy and rivalry amongst the churches. And I don't think it surprised you either that your pastor, this guy right here, has to guard himself from such conversations. Okay? Just so you can kind of take a look into some of my worldly heart, all right? Whenever we were in Panama on a mission trip, I don't know if you guys know this about the Panamanians, but their main sport is volleyball, and they love to beat the gringos in volleyball, okay? And not only do they enjoy beating them, but I'm just going to tell you, all of them are about this tall, okay? And they're still going to beat you in volleyball, okay? But me and one of my pastor friends from Elk City, we lost a game. And one of the guys that was from Thomas, he's laughing and he says, the most competitive people I know are always pastors. And I didn't say a word. I guess it was just written all over my face of how disappointed I was in losing to the Panamanians yet another game. But what I'm saying is that a great deal of competition is going to come out in my heart often. Now, competition's fun. I said quite obviously, we even have competitions on some nights, on Sunday night, for those of you who come to where we're just having a fun-filled night instead of doing some of those things. But what I am going to say is that it's got no place in the church whenever it comes to the real work of Christ. Okay, envy only leads to competition to hostility to conflict, and now we are divided amongst ourselves. Okay? That it shouldn't be like that from town to town, church to church, or whatever else. We are part of the church, and I wish we would think about it more like that than what we do. But even with that, if there is envy and rivalry, look in verse 17. What is their motive for preaching Christ? They preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. So it's going something like this, that Paul's in prison. He must not have been faithful. He must have done something wrong, and now God's punishing him. Let's take advantage of him being imprisoned, and we'll preach Christ all the more, okay? We will regain our influence in the church, okay? And I know that sounds bad. I want to tell you that some preachers, they do preach like that. I pray against it, and I think that I probably have also fallen into temptation in that. But one of the things I can hang my hat on is that my motives do not save anyone. The gospel of Jesus Christ, leading them to know Him, is what saves people. It is not about the one who is proclaiming, but the one who they are proclaiming. Does that make sense? The true power is in that. But one of the things you and I better be careful with is that we do come into judgment ourselves with Christ, even down to our motive for doing a good deed. It doesn't matter what it is, we will be judged for even our motives and our heart attitudes towards these things. And so with that's that motive. Let's look at the good motive here. Verse 16, the latter, they do it out of goodwill. They do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. They aren't looking at Paul's circumstances and trying to claim some sort of judgment on him. They're not looking at Paul's circumstances and trying to vilify him. They're seeing it as the Lord Jesus has began to do a work. They are doing it not only out of the love for Christ, but they are doing it out of the love for Paul himself. And this boldness has began. Just a story I love from Scripture. At the end of the book of John, there's a story about Simon Peter, that whenever he had denied Jesus 3 times openly and publicly, that Jesus has now came to him and is about to restore Peter because of his denials. But this is the way that he does it. And I really think that it helps motivate Peter and give him the correct motives for the rest of his ministry. Is that Peter had denied him 3 times, and so Jesus asked him 3 times, Simon, do you love me? And he asked him again, do you love me? And again, do you love me? It goes something like this. Do you love me more than the people in this life? Do you love me more than your old life? Do you love me more than the aspirations that you have for your life? Do you love me more than prestige or influence? And this is Jesus trying to weed out some of those motives so that he might actually maintain his ministry throughout the rest of the time. But every time he asked, Peter would say something, yes, Lord, I love you. And then he finally says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And then Jesus answers him every one of those times and he says, so feed my sheep. Tend to my lambs. What? You see what he's doing, what he's bringing him to? We proclaim the gospel because we know him, because we love him, because we know Christ, because we love Christ, because he has done a work inside of us, because he has shown us more mercy than what we ever deserve. We know that true life and true joy flows from that man himself, and he's trying to say, preach Christ out of the right motive so that others might be able to have that true joy as well. And so we're kind of seeing what Paul is just driving at, is that they're also being a part of the defense of the gospel inside of Rome. They're coming, and we said, with the correct motives and all of these things. But with that, let's kind of finish off the whole idea of rejoicing or having joy in the advancement of the gospel. Verse 18. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Paul has cut out all the childish games. They don't even mean anything to him anymore. It's not about moving up the career ladder to him anymore. It's only about the advancement of the gospel. He says, I know that they tried, so that they mean to afflict me. I know that they mean to do me harm, but their motives for preaching Christ, they don't even have an effect on me anymore. You want to know why? Because my life is sold out for the sole cause of advancing the gospel and knowing Jesus himself. And if they're preaching Christ out of a poor motive to afflict me, who cares? People are still coming to Christ, and in that I rejoice. The childish games have now been cut out of it. They're not worried about, he's not worried about the things that people are trying to do. He's worried about what Jesus is going to think of his church whenever he comes back. Now, this is one of the points of application I want to make here. We all have this way about us of we like to customize things, okay? Whatever it might be. So we all have a way of customizing our phones. Some of you do a lot less customizing, but that's because of your ignorance to the phone. But even with that said, we all have a way of customizing our own lives. We like things this way, we like things that way, whatever it might be. And then whenever we come to faith, we think that we're going to do the same thing. But the problem with that is that in and of itself, that creates some sort of competition. Okay? Now, well, I'm right because the Bible says, or it's like, well, we've done it like this for years. Why would it be wrong? I was like, guys, we have a way of vilifying people, especially the way our culture tries to get us to do that. It has no place in the church or the way that we are actually going to judge a church as to whether or not it's the right one. It's not right. And if we vilify people just because they don't do church the way I think they should, you know what you're more worried about? You're more worried about comfort then, aren't you? When did the church ever become about anything else besides declaring the glory of the risen Savior? And so if we just boil that down to this very basic message here, it's like the gospel that we started off with. Are we more worried about Christ's glory, or are we just more worried about doing church the way that we want it to be done? Because if it's the former, we have lost, or our motives have now become incorrect. Our motives are out of line. Whenever we approach church with only the very fact that we want Christ to be known and we want to know Him more, then the advancement of the gospel is just going to ignite joy inside of your heart that no circumstance is going to end up taking from you then, will it? And so if people might be doing something a little bit different, look what Paul's doing. Are they preaching a different gospel? These men who mean to afflict me, are they preaching a different Jesus than whom I know? He says, well, no, they're not. Which means I rejoice in their work. That's all right. They're still preaching Christ, and they're preaching Christ well. And so, let them go. I don't care. What could we do that too? Could you guys be a part of this? Be able to say, that's a little bit different, but I still see how the glory of Christ is being progressed through that effort. Let's glory in that. Okay? Now, I think I know, I may not know, but I think I know what some of you guys are thinking. I have believed the gospel my whole life. I don't think I've ever experienced divine joy before. Or it's like, Brother Brandon, circumstances are pretty tough right now. Joy is the furthest thing from my mind. What am I to do? Well, let me just kind of tell you some of Paul's story just real quick. Paul, who was a persecutor of the church, being sure that he had Christians captured and then put to death, was met by Jesus Christ Himself on the road to Damascus. Transformed from the inside out, he gave his life for the advancement of the gospel. And because he had given his life to that, he was then stoned. He was then beaten. He was then imprisoned. He was maligned. He was snake bit. He was shipwrecked multiple times. He was in prison, and we're reading something from the end of his life after all of these things have happened. He has been in and out of relationships, has been in all sorts of church conflicts. If anybody has a reason to allow their circumstances to have control them, I feel like Paul could have caved in some point in his life and said, I'm done. This is too much. But you know what? He knew the living Christ Himself, and it didn't happen. The fact of the matter is that at the end of his life, as he's writing this very thing, he's saying, I have found the secret to life, where circumstances will never control me ever again, but I am going to live for the glory and the advancement of Christ in all things. But our joy is typically based in things that are going to fade away, aren't they? You think, I'd be very very joyful if I could just talk to so-and-so again. I'd be very, very joyful if this job would work out. I'd be very, very joyful if I just had more of this. I'd be very, very joyful if my husband would just love. All of these good things, all those things are not eternal, are they? So going back to what I said earlier, you trying to fill an eternal void with something that isn't eternal? No wonder there's not a divine joy. Paul is saying, look at whom I know. It fills you so full that there is nothing in life that is going to come your way that is going to ultimately steal that joy. Rather, your circumstances become something that feeds that divine joy. So may we begin to change our perspective towards that. So you guys bow with me. Dear Lord,